Hello, Jeff Zwerink, and welcome to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific issues and events and see how they relate to the truth of Christianity. Today, we're joined again by founder and president of Reasons to Believe, Dr. Hugh Ross. We're here to discuss the life and career of Francis Collins. Hugh, it's good to have you here today.
Well, thank you.
So Francis Collins recently stepped down as the director of the National Institute of Health. I know you've had some interactions with him personally, has some connections to BioLogos. So kind of just give a little bit of background. How do you know Francis Collins, and how have you interacted with him?
Well, I got to meet him shortly after he stepped down from the president of BioLogos to take up his position at NIH. That was a requirement that he do that. And he actually had several of us here at Reasons to Believe into his home in Washington, D.C. about a dozen years ago. And his goal was that there would be a dialogue between Reasons to Believe and BioLogos where we could discuss the differences we have theologically and scientifically, but in a spirit of respect and charity.
So kind of highlight, what are some of the ways that you agree and disagree with Francis Collins?
Well, both of us are adult converts.
Okay.
And what impressed him in terms of coming to faith in Christ was the recognition that the universe had a beginning and the universe was fine-tuned to make possible our existence. And that's kind of the same thing it was with me. And that's where we agree. You know, he does like to give his testimony just like I do. So, and I like the fact that he is very committed to trying to exemplify Christ-like character. So those are the areas where we agree.
So those are pretty important areas of agreement. You know, I think I would just make a statement. I mean, it's implicit in our conversation, but just to be explicit, I mean, you're convinced that Francis Collins is a committed follower of Christ and wants to serve and honor God, correct?
I am. I've heard him give his testimony. I've heard him present the gospel. He's passionate about seeing people come to faith in Christ.
So tell us some of the differences that you have with Francis Collins.
Well, we have significant theological and scientific differences. Theologically, the way he looks at the biblical creation accounts is very different than what we have Reasons to Believe.
Kind of put a little bit of detail, if you could, for us.
Well, we see the creation texts, especially those in Genesis, as being historical, as describing real physical events, that they're to be taken literally, and they're to be integrated with the other creation texts, whereas Francis Collins and his BioLogos research team tend to look at it as more of an allegory or a myth, trying to communicate a larger theological point than an actual account of real historical physical events.
That's not a small difference in how you look at things, and it seems to have pretty important implications for how you view Christianity, if you will.
Well, I mean, in our dialogues with them over the past decade or so, I've noticed that both our scientists and theologians say that we take that position really impacts how we interpret the book of Romans. And the book of Romans is not a trivial doctrinal book.
Right.
And so we have a big difference on, you know, do we actually look at Adam and Eve as being the sole progenitor of all human beings? We do. They struggle with that, looking more like it's a population than just a single couple.
Right.
And then they also struggle with this doctrine of original sin. You know, so I've heard them say Romans 5 is a big issue for them. And so Romans 5 is a major text over which we disagree. And of course, we disagree significantly on the scientific issues as well.
Right. So these are not trivial differences. These are important, I mean, you know, maybe even hitting at the heart of Christianity, if you will. So I know you've recently written a tribute to Francis Collins. I know you've taken some heat for that. How can you write a tribute to a person who has such profound differences with your position?
Well, what I really appreciated about Francis is, you know, this idea of science and faith is highly divisive within the Christian community. And people who take different positions tend to be rather acrimonious towards one another. And he says, I'm committed to show a different example. And I said, well, I am too. And so he was the one that encouraged a dialogue between our two organizations. You participated in that dialogue. And we wound up writing a Two Views book. And if you read the Two Views book, we lay out our very substantial differences. And these differences are not trivial. I mean, that actually goes to what you see in the creeds of the Christian church. So these are very significant differences. But if you read the book, you can see that although in spite of our differences, we do treat and write about one another in a respectful, charitable tone. I've done public events with the now new president of, in fact, both the past presidents have succeeded, Francis Collins, Darrell Falk, as well as Deborah Harzma. But what I'm encouraged is that they took on the legacy of Francis Collins, express their differences, but do it respectfully and do it charitably. And what I really like about that is 2 Corinthians 5 says to us as believers that we're being watched. Non-Christians watch us, and to see how we treat one another. And 2 Corinthians 5 says God's called us to be ambassadors, to call unbelievers to make peace with God. How can they do that if they don't see us making peace with one another in spite of our differences? So recognizing that this is a barrier to spreading the gospel when we begin to treat one another in an uncharitable way.
Well, and that kind of raises a point that I would like to get your take on is, a lot of Christians I have seen, especially on social media, and we could argue the merits of social media in a different place, but especially on social media, have been very harsh, questioning his salvation. How can you even be associated, affiliated? How do you respond to that vitriol that has been directed at a man that, as best I can tell, has worked really hard to live a godly life in a very challenging office, if you will?
It is a challenging office, and the reason I made my comment on social media, he has broken the record for the longest service as the head of NIH. Previous leaders have made the point. It's a very challenging position to hold. And what I was noticing is a lot of Christians were blaming Francis Collins for every fault, every mistake, every bad thing that NIH has done, National Institute of Health has done over the 12 years, as if as the head of NIH, he could actually control and be responsible for everything that happened under his tutelage. It'd be like me being held to account for every mistake that's happened and reasons to believe. I'm only the president. I don't know everything. I can't control everything.
But in some sense, he is. As the president, you are ultimately responsible. So how is he not? I tend to agree with you. I'm just kind of pushing a little bit. How is he not held responsible, or why shouldn't we hold him responsible?
Well, he needs to be held reasonably responsible. To put at his feet everything that went wrong at NIH. I mean, he's a human being. So we need to cut him a little bit of slack, and and also recognize. And people said, "Hey, he actually did X. He actually did Y. Isn't that sinful?" And I say to the people who make those charges, "Well, what about you? Have you ever done anything that's sinful in your life?" I mean, we're all sinners. And the point is, what do we do with our sin? And the thing I've noticed about Francis is that he seems reasonably forthcoming and say, that was a mistake. And Paul says we're not to be perfect, we're to be blameless. There's a difference. Blameless means you own up to the things that you've done wrong and do what you can to make them right. And of course, none of us do that perfectly. I'm not saying Francis Collins has done that perfectly, but I think he at least recognizes his responsibility in that area.
Well, thank you, Hugh. I very much appreciate your comments. Francis Collins has had a remarkable career, remarkably long career at the NIH, and I'm sure he's done things that he would prefer to have done differently, but yet in his office, it really does seem like he has tried to honor God in his career. And one thing that we know for sure is that he is passionate about his relationship with God and committing to sharing the gospel with RTB's demeanor as well, with a commitment to gentleness and respect. I'd encourage you to go to reasons.org, check out Hugh's latest blog that talks about a tribute to Francis Collins to see how we can agree or disagree in an agreeable way and be good ambassadors for Christ and share the gospel with those God brings across our path.